A billionaire sat frozen as a waitress spoke fluent French to a stranger, words that stirred memories he'd buried. Minutes later, she found a note and a plane ticket to Paris on her table. But why would a man of untold wealth send her across the ocean, and what truth waited there? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The cafe was loud that morning, its tables full of office workers hurrying through breakfast before the trading bell, students typing frantically at laptops, and tourists staring wide-eyed at maps they barely understood. Elena Ramirez moved among them with practiced balance, 3 plates in her left hand, 2 cups balanced on a tray in her right. Her black hair was pulled into a neat bun, strands slipping free against the sweat at her temple. She wore a smile that looked easy to the customers but cost her effort to maintain. Elena had been working double shifts for weeks, patching together enough to pay rent and help cover her younger brother's college tuition. She was 25, her dreams of travel and study long shelved beneath bills and responsibility. Yet when she leaned down to place a cappuccino before a tired lawyer, she still carried the warmth of someone who believed kindness was never wasted. At the corner table, a man unfolded the New York Times with careful precision. His suit was midnight blue, the cut subtle yet unmistakably expensive. Gabriel Duval rarely ventured into noisy places like this. He was the kind of man who lived behind tinted glass, traveling between skyscrapers and boardrooms where silence could be bought. But something about this cafe, small, human, alive, had pulled him in when his morning meeting was postponed. He read with half his mind, his sharp gaze catching on financial numbers that shaped empires. Yet his attention drifted when a French accent stumbled into the room. A tourist in his early 30s stood at the counter, struggling to communicate with the barista. His gestures were clumsy, his English broken. The line grew restless. Someone muttered, "Come on, hurry up," while the man's face flushed crimson. Elena, balancing an order pad against her hip, noticed. She stepped forward, brushing past a coworker. "Excuse me," she said gently in French, her voice soft yet steady. "Do you need help?" The man's face lit with relief. "Ah, merci." Enfin, quell it quickly. "On my way?" Twitching, fluently, Elena guided him through the menu, translating with ease, adding warmth to her tone. She laughed softly at his joke about American coffee being brown water, and even recommended the croissant. "Not Paris quality," she admitted, in French, "but it will comfort you." The tourist smiled, order placed, tension gone. The people in line relaxed, impressed by Elena's sudden transformation from waitress to translator. At his corner, Gabriel lowered his newspaper. His dark eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in intrigue. French was his mother tongue, and in Elena's effortless cadence, he heard not just fluency, but history. Nuances no textbook could teach. Her gestures, her rhythm, the light in her face as she bridged worlds for a stranger, it disarmed him in a way nothing in finance or power ever could. He watched her return to her routine as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. To Elena, it was reflex. She'd grown up in a bilingual household, her late grandmother whispering lullabies in French while her mother scolded her in Spanish and her school drilled her in English. Languages were her hidden refuge, though no one in the cafe cared about that. She picked up plates, cleared crumbs, and moved on. But Gabriel didn't. His gaze followed her as she bent to comfort a crying child, as she straightened a crooked table number, as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear while scribbling an order. He found himself listening for her laugh, the way it softened the edges of the air. "Another coffee, sir?" Elena asked minutes later, sliding by his table. He looked up. For a moment, Gabriel, billionaire, investor, feared negotiator, hesitated. He could close deals worth billions with a single word. Yet, here, with this waitress, he felt his voice falter. "Yes," he said finally. "Merci." Her brows lifted slightly at the French. Their eyes locked, just long enough for Elena to feel a flicker of something she didn't understand. Then the moment passed. She nodded, polite, and moved away. Gabriel set his newspaper down, unread. His mind was elsewhere, back in Paris, back in childhood streets lined with bakeries and old stone. He had left that world behind for boardrooms and battles, yet, in a single sentence from a stranger, it had returned. By the time Elena carried his refill, his decision was already forming. The café was loud again. She placed the cup gently before him. He thanked her once more in French. This time she smiled. When she clocked out at the end of her shift, exhausted and ready for the long subway ride home, she opened the leather checkbook where she had tallied Gabriel's bill. Tucked inside was not just a tip, but a folded note, written in strong, deliberate handwriting. "You belong in Paris. Meet me at the airport. A ticket awaits." Her hands trembled. For the first time in years, Elena's heart skipped with something dangerous. Hope. Elena stood frozen at the employee lockers, staring at the slip of paper. Her first instinct was suspicion. Rich men played games, and she had no desire to be anyone's entertainment. She shoved the note into her apron pocket, trying to laugh it off. Yet the words clung to her, whispering through every step of her commute home. "You belong in Paris." The subway was packed, the air heavy with damp coats and weary silence. Elena sat wedged between strangers, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Paris, the word pulled at something she had buried. Her grandmother's voice teaching her French songs, her childhood sketchbooks filled with drawings of the Seine and the Eiffel Tower, the dreams she had once whispered to teachers before rent and life crushed it down. At home, the apartment was dim, cluttered but clean. Her younger brother Marco hunched over textbooks at the kitchen table. "Long day?" he asked without looking up. "Long," she replied softly, hanging her coat. She didn't mention the note. How could she? They lived paycheck to paycheck. Paris was as unreachable as the moon. Meanwhile, in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Gabriel sat by the window, glass of wine untouched. He replayed Elena's voice in his mind. The cadence, the sincerity. He had spent his life among people fluent in manipulation, but she was fluent in something else entirely. Humanity. His assistant had raised a brow when Gabriel instructed him to book an extra seat on his private jet. "For whom, sir?" Gabriel only said, "For someone who's forgotten she belongs elsewhere." The next morning, Elena folded the note again, determined to ignore it. She returned to the café. Life carried on, tables to serve, dishes to clear, laughter to fake. But every time she wiped down a counter, her mind whispered, "What if?" When her shift ended, she lingered outside, the December air biting her cheeks. She pulled the note free once more, tracing the words. She told herself it was absurd, reckless, dangerous, but beneath the fear, a spark of longing refused to die. That night, Elena dreamed of Paris, lit by golden street lamps, laughter echoing against stone walls, a hand reaching for hers. And when she woke, the note was still there. Elena barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, the ceiling shadows shifting as cars passed on the street outside. The note burned in her pocket like a secret too heavy to ignore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the handwriting again. Sharp, deliberate strokes. "You belong in Paris. Meet me at the airport. A ticket awaits." She told herself it had to be a trick. Who leaves such a message for a stranger? She had served coffee and carried plates, nothing more. Men with suits that sharp didn't glance twice at women like her, much less hand them chances that sounded like fairy tales. And yet, she couldn't dismiss the sincerity of the moment. She remembered his voice, the quiet mercy that felt heavier than two syllables should. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not with pity or hunger, but as if he'd recognized something familiar in her. By 3 a.m, she sat up and switched on the lamp. Her brother stirred in the next room, murmuring in his sleep. She opened the envelope again, running her fingers over the edges of the plane ticket. It was real-etched with her name, Elena Ramirez, and a departure time less than 24 hours away. Destination, Paris. Her heart clenched. Paris wasn't just a city, it was a ghost. When Elena was a child, her mother would sit her on her lap and trace fingers over picture books of France, whispering the names of bridges and gardens as though they were fairy tale lands. "Someday," her mother would say, eyes shining despite the exhaustion of long shifts, "someday, we'll walk there together." But someday never came. Illness stole her mother before Elena was old enough to work. The books remained, their spines cracked, their pages smudged by tears and time. Elena had carried them into adulthood, like relics of a promise that had died with her. Now, in her trembling hands, was something too cruelly close to that promise. A chance, she whispered into the darkness, as though her mother could hear. Should I go? The silence of the room was answer enough. By morning, she was a storm of doubt. She went to work as usual, apron tied tight, smile plastered on. She moved mechanically through the café, though her co-workers teased her about looking distracted. Inside, her stomach flipped with fear and longing. When her shift ended, Elena stood outside the employee door, staring at the winter sky. The ticket pressed against her palm. She thought of rent, of Marco's tuition, of the weight of responsibility. She thought of her mother's voice, Paris in her dreams. And then she moved. Her hands shook as she packed a small bag, just clothes, her passport, and her mother's old French book. She scribbled a note for Marco, working extra shifts, don't worry. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. She told herself she would be back before he even noticed. The taxi to the airport smelled faintly of pine air freshener. Elena stared out at the city, every block reminding her of how far she was stepping from her world. She almost asked the driver to turn back, but when they pulled into the terminal and she saw the glowing departures board, she felt something break loose in her chest. Fear, yes, but also exhilaration. At the gate, the attendant scanned her ticket without question. No trick, no joke. The plane loomed, sleek and white, a bird of promise. Elena's legs wobbled as she walked down the jet bridge. She clutched her bag like armor, her breath shallow. And then she saw him. Gabriel Duval sat in first class, dark suit immaculate, reading a book in French. His presence was effortless, his calm a stark contrast to her, trembling. When he lifted his gaze and met hers, recognition flickered. His lips curved into the faintest smile, as if he had been expecting her all along. Elena froze. She had imagined 100 outcomes, no ticket, no plane, no man. But here he was, real, steady, impossible to ignore. Her seat was further back, but as she passed him, his voice caught her. Louise Agnès, wasn't sure you'd come, he said quietly, his French accent rolling over the words. Elena swallowed hard, gripping her bag tighter. I wasn't sure either. Their eyes held for a moment, a silent current sparking between them. Then she walked on, her heart racing faster than the engines preparing for takeoff. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled. Elena pressed her forehead to the window, watching the tarmac glow under the floodlights. She could hardly breathe. What am I doing here, she thought. I don't belong on this plane. I don't belong in his world. Yet when the engines roared and the aircraft lifted, a strange calm filled her chest. For the first time in years, she was leaving New York behind. The skyline shrank to sparks below, and with it, the weight of routine. Hours passed. Flight attendants served dinner, the clatter of trays filling the air. Elena barely touched her food. She kept glancing down the aisle, where Gabriel sat alone, reading. He never once looked restless or unsure, only absorbed, as though the world outside could collapse and he would still be steady. Finally, when the cabin quieted and passengers dozed, Gabriel rose. His footsteps were measured as he approached her row. Elena's breath caught when he stopped beside her seat. Walk with me, he said softly. She hesitated, but something in his tone left no room for refusal. She followed him to the back galley, where only the hum of engines filled the silence. Gabriel studied her for a moment. You think this is madness? She admitted, voice trembling. A stranger leaves a ticket and a note? It feels like a trap. His expression softened, though his gaze stayed sharp. It isn't. You wouldn't have taken it if I'd asked directly. You would have laughed and gone back to work. But sometimes, the only way to show someone they're meant for more is to give them wings. Elena folded her arms, defensive. And what do you know about me? I'm just a waitress. You spoke French like someone who had lived it, he said. And you helped a man with kindness when no one else cared. That is not just. She blinked, startled by the conviction in his voice. Gabriel continued, lower now. Do you know why I was there yesterday? My boardroom deals are endless, my life is noise. But I sat in that café, and for the first time in years, I saw grace. A reminder that there is more than power and money. That's what you gave me. Alina's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him, but suspicion lingered. Why Paris? His eyes flickered with something almost tender. Because it's where I found myself once, and because I think it's where you might find yourself too. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the low drone of the plane. Elena looked away, fighting the pull in her chest. But he was in no mood for his oblongs. He whispered. Gabriel shook his head gently. It isn't about worlds, it's about choices, and this one is yours. He left her then, returning to his seat, leaving Elena trembling in the galley. She pressed a hand to her heart, realizing it wasn't fear keeping it racing, it was possibility. When the plane descended hours later, dawn spilling pink across the horizon, Elena stared at the outline of Paris below. The scene shimmered, the Eiffel Tower piercing the morning sky. Tears stung her eyes. For the first time, her mother's dream felt alive again. As wheels touched the runway, Elena whispered to herself, I'm here, Mama. And she wondered if this chance, born of a note and a stranger, might be the beginning of something greater than she dared to imagine. The first full morning in Paris broke with soft light pressing through the shutters of the guest room. Elena sat up slowly, still uncertain if the day before had been a dream. Her suitcase rested against the wall, her mother's worn French poetry book lying open on the bedside table. Paris was real, she reminded herself. She was here. Gabriel had said they would visit a gallery, and when she descended to the kitchen, she found him already waiting, a cup of black coffee in hand. He greeted her with a nod, his posture as precise as a chess piece, but there was something less guarded in his eyes. Ready to see the city properly? He asked. She answered with a tentative smile. I think so, though I'm not sure Paris is ready for me. That earned her the smallest curve of his mouth, something between amusement and encouragement. Moments later, the driver was waiting, and they were off through the streets of the left bank. Elena pressed her face to the glass like a child, staring at the rows of bookstalls along the Seine. The iron balconies heavy with plants, the narrow streets that seemed to carry centuries on their stone. Their first stop was an art gallery, tucked behind a courtyard of climbing ivy. Inside, sunlight spilled across canvases that spoke in colors Elena had only ever seen in textbooks. She lingered before a painting of a mother holding a child beneath a flowering tree. Her throat tightened. Mother would have loved this, she whispered. Gabriel stepped closer, his voice low. You said yesterday she carried dreams she couldn't afford. That is a kind of courage many overlook. Elena glanced at him, startled by the gentleness in his tone. She turned away quickly, afraid he might see too much in her expression. From there they walked, crossing streets where scooters darted past and the smell of bread drifted out from bakeries. Gabriel moved with the steady ease of someone who belonged, while Elena trailed behind, both enchanted and hesitant. She felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life, borrowed for the day. At a café tucked into a corner square, they sat outside under a striped awning. Students nearby argued over literature, their words bright and careless. One line caught Elena's ear. She straightened, smiling before she realized it. "You know it?" Gabriel asked, watching her. She nodded, and before nerves could silence her, she spoke. Sous le pont Mirabeau coulale. The words left her in careful French, a poem her mother had recited by heart when Elena was just a child. Et nos amours, faut qu'il m'en souvienne. Her voice trembled, but the memory steadied her. When she finished, silence lingered between them, heavier than the hum of traffic. Gabriel's gaze was fixed on her, his expression softened in a way she had not seen before. I carry Paris already, he said quietly. Heat rushed to her cheeks. No, I only carry my mother's memory. I'm just borrowing it a while. But inside, the words settled deep. She carried more than memory. She carried longing, strength, and the ability to give life to words even when she felt unworthy. Later, at a historic library, Elena wandered between the stacks, fingertips grazing spines worn by time. She felt small and infinite at once, the kind of paradox her mother used to describe when speaking of books. Gabriel watched from a distance, the corners of his lips curving faintly as she sat at a desk, head bent over a volume of French verse. She looked at home in a way he hadn't seen before. It was evening when they finally returned to the townhouse. Elena thanked him awkwardly, unsettled by how much of herself she had revealed in just one day. "I feel like I stole something," she said softly, "as if this world isn't meant for me." Gabriel shook his head. "Beauty is not stolen, Elena, it is shared." His words haunted her long after she lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds of Paris at night. The next day, Gabriel introduced Elena to more corners of Paris, hidden cafes that smelled of roasted chestnuts, narrow streets where musicians played violins, libraries where silence hummed like prayer. Elena tried to memorize everything, but a part of her still felt like a trespasser in a story that wasn't hers. It was during supper in a dim bistro that shadows began to emerge. The owner greeted Gabriel warmly, clapping him on the shoulder, then leaned in close to Elena as he poured wine. "Be careful, mademoiselle," he said with a knowing smile. "Our Gabriel has a habit of rescuing lost birds." Confused, Elena glanced at Gabriel, but he was busy unfolding his napkin, face unreadable. The comment clung to her like smoke. Later, when they walked back to the townhouse, she finally asked, her voice quiet but steady, "What did he mean? Rescuing lost birds?" Gabriel stopped mid-step, his expression tightening. For a moment, she thought he would ignore the question. Then, with a sigh, he spoke. "Once, years ago, I was engaged to a woman who loved what I could give her, not who I was. She wore the mask of affection until she no longer needed it. When she left, she took more than money, she took trust. Since then, the world assumes every woman near me must want the same." His words were sharp, but beneath them, Elena caught the faint tremor of old wounds. She wrapped her arms around herself, unsure what to say. "And now, they think I'm another one of those women," she whispered. Gabriel looked at her, the streetlight casting shadows across his face. "I don't think that." A stranger played from a café. Stranger plucked from a café. "Tell me that doesn't sound like another project. Another lost bird to rescue." Silence hung between them, heavy as the Paris night. Gabriel's jaw clenched. "Perhaps I wanted to see what you would do when given a choice. Perhaps I needed to see if someone could still take a leap without expecting something in return." Elena's chest ached. She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. She remembered her mother's warnings, whispered before long shifts. "Be careful who offers you the world, Hija. Sometimes the price is your soul." When they reached the townhouse, she paused at the guest room door. "I don't need saving, Gabriel," she said quietly. "I've survived long enough on my own." And before he could answer, she closed the door between them. At night, Elena lay awake, torn between enchantment and suspicion. Paris had opened its arms, but the shadow of doubt lingered. Was she here because she was special, or because she was convenient for a man haunted by betrayal? She didn't know, but she knew one thing with painful certainty: her heart was already at risk. The following days in Paris unfolded with a rhythm Elena could not quite settle into. Gabriel's world moved like a perfectly wound clock, brave precisely at 8, meetings lined up without a pause, dinners that began and ended on his word. Even their walks through the city seemed scheduled, his stride purposeful, while hers slowed at the sight of street artists sketching lovers or musicians coaxing life from old violins. At first, she tried to match him, tucking her questions away and keeping her laughter quiet, afraid of breaking into the silence he carried like a shield. But it soon wore on her. She had not come to Paris to march through it like an office. One afternoon, after hours of listening to him on the phone with business associates, she finally snapped. "Do you ever live, Gabriel, or do you only control?" He looked at her, startled by the sharpness in her voice. "I provide, I protect. That is living." She shook her head. That's hiding from people, from risk, from anything you can't manage like one of your investment portfolios. The air between them turned brittle. Gabriel's jaw set, his eyes hardening. And what do you know of risk? You're a waitress who dreams of books and cities you cannot afford. I admire it, but don't confuse it with living. Dreaming is easy, building is not. The words cut deep. Elena stiffened, her cheeks hot. You think dreaming is easy? Try keeping it alive when the world tries to grind it out of you. My mother dreamed of Paris every day of her life, and it slipped away from her. I hold on to it because if I don't, then she lived and died for nothing. Silence followed, thick and raw. Gabriel's hand tightened on his glass until his knuckles whitened, but he said nothing more. That night, they ate in separate rooms, the distance between them heavier than the walls. The next day, their tension lingered. They visited a museum, but Elena could not enjoy the paintings with his critical gaze following her. When she lingered too long at a Monet, he muttered something about romanticizing the trivial. She wanted to scream at him. Instead, she drifted away into another room, needing space to breathe. That was when she saw the little boy. He couldn't have been more than 6, his cheeks streaked with tears, his French words choked with fear as he clutched the hem of his coat. His parents were nowhere in sight. People passed him by, sparing only a glance before moving on. Elena knelt down instantly, her voice gentle. "Que is perdu?" she asked softly. "Are you lost?" The boy sniffled, nodding, his tiny hands trembling. Elena switched into fluent French, asking his name, where he had last seen his parents. Slowly, his sobs quieted. He clung to her hand, his eyes wide but calmer, as she led him to the security desk. Gabriel arrived just as the parents rushed forward, crying with relief. He stopped short, his eyes fixed on Elena. The way she bent low to meet the child's eyes, the warmth in her tone, the patience in her every word, it was unlike anything he had ever carried in his own life. Later, as they left the museum, Gabriel broke the silence. "You spoke to him as if you had known him all your life." She shrugged. "Because I knew his fear. Being lost doesn't always mean not knowing where you are. Sometimes it means no one sees you." Words struck something deep within him, though he said nothing. That night, as he watched her from across the dining room, he realized with an ache in his chest that Elena carried a warmth he had spent years denying himself. But the memory of their fight still lingered, echoing between them, even in the gentler moments. Gabriel found himself replaying her words. That's hiding from people, from risks. He had always believed control was his strength, yet when he watched Elena smile at strangers, laugh at something simple, or stop to admire flowers in a market, he wondered if perhaps control had only been his prison. One evening, they walked through the narrow streets of Montmartre. The city buzzed with artists displaying sketches, music spilling from open doors. Elena paused before a street painter, who offered to draw her portrait for a few euros. She agreed, sitting with her head tilted, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. Gabriel stood back, watching. The portrait was quick, imperfect, but when the artist turned it around, Elena's face lit up. "It doesn't look exactly like me," she said, "but maybe it looks like who I want to be." The remark lingered in Gabriel's mind. Later he asked her, "Why do you say that? Why not who you are?" She smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering with something fragile. "Because I'm still learning who that is. Maybe Paris will help me find her." At the night, Gabriel could not sleep. Her words stirred echoes of his own doubts, memories of a life where every move was measured, every friendship tested, every promise doubted. He had spent so long building walls of wealth and discipline that he had forgotten how to be anything else. A few days later, another clash erupted. Gabriel criticized her for spending too much time speaking with vendors at a market, calling it wasting hours. Elena spun on him, anger flashing in her eyes. "You even hear yourself? Wasting hours? These are lives, Gabriel. People. Stories. You can learn more in 10 minutes at a fruit stall than in a year locked in your office." His reply was cold. "Romantic notions don't feed the world, Elena. Discipline does." Her voice broke, but she stood firm. "And what has discipline given you, Gabriel? You live surrounded by people, yet you're alone. You have everything, yet you look starved. Don't you see? You've hidden behind your wealth so long, you don't even know who you are anymore." Words hit like a mirror shattering, every shard reflecting a truth he didn't want to face. He turned away, unable to answer. That evening, they barely spoke. But as fate often does, it shifted the ground beneath them when Gabriel least expected. Walking back through the park near the townhouse, they passed a young girl, no older than Mia, lost and crying for her parents. Elena immediately knelt, soothing her in perfect French, telling her she was safe. Se laid to a bench, humming softly until the parents arrived, weeping with gratitude. Gabriel watched silently. The scene mirrored the one at the museum, but this time it pierced him even deeper. Elena didn't just speak French, she spoke human. She reached into fear and drew out hope, something he had never known how to do. That night, lying awake, Gabriel admitted something to himself he had long denied. Perhaps Elena wasn't the one out of place in his world. Perhaps he was the one out of place in hers. For the first time in years, he began to question the man behind the mask he wore so carefully. The city sparkled as if it had dressed itself in diamonds for the night. Parisian streets shimmered with golden lamplight, carriages and sleek cars pulling up to the Palais Garnier, where Gabriel Duval's latest gala was being held. Inside, champagne flutes clinked against crystal, chandeliers bathed the marble floors in an otherworldly glow, and the air was thick with perfume and expectation. For Gabriel, nights like these had long since become routine. Another evening of networking, another stage on which his wealth and power were silently measured. For Elena, however, this world was still foreign. She walked into the grand hall by Gabriel's side, her modest gown carefully chosen, not flashy but elegant, a pale blue that reminded her of the sky her mother once pointed to as they lay on their tiny rooftop in Queens, imagining Paris. Elena held her head high, her back straight, repeating to herself that she belonged here. Not because of Gabriel, not because of the diamonds that glittered on the women passing her by, but because she was Elena Ramirez, a woman with her own worth. Yet the whispers began almost immediately. "'Twas a waitress, you know," one woman in a sequined gown murmured behind her fan. "Waitress?" Another man chuckled. How very Parisian of Gabriel to take on a charity project. Elena's steps faltered, but she pressed forward, ignoring the sting of their words. She had endured worse, mockery in school when her clothes didn't fit, condescending smiles from wealthy customers who assumed she didn't understand their French. Still, hearing it here, in this palace of luxury, struck differently. It was as if her mother's ghost lingered in the corners, whispering that no matter how far she traveled, the world would always remind her of where she came from. Gabriel, standing tall beside her, heard the whispers too. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He thought he was protecting her, shielding her by pretending not to hear. In his mind, ignoring their venom would make it disappear. He didn't realize that his silence was a blade, cutting deeper than their words ever could. At one point, Elena excused herself and slipped into the powder room, her hands trembling as she clutched the sink. Her reflection stared back at her, the girl from the café, the woman who translated French for tourists, the dreamer who once imagined Paris with her mother. Now, beneath the crystal lights of Paris's elite, she looked like an imposter wearing borrowed skin. The bathroom door creaked open, and two women swept inside, their laughter sharp as broken glass. "Did you see the way she held her fork? Mon Dieu, it's like she's never been to a real dinner before. She'll be gone in a week." Gabriel grows bored easily. Their words pierced Elena's already fragile resolve. She wanted to shout that they didn't know her, that her life was more than this, that she carried scars and resilience they couldn't fathom. But instead, she bit her lip until it bled and slipped out quietly, her chest aching as though her ribs were made of glass. When she returned to the ballroom, Gabriel was surrounded by investors. His laughter was smooth, his posture flawless, the mask of control firmly in place. Elena lingered at the edge of the crowd, waiting for his eyes to find hers, waiting for him to reach out and pull her into his circle. But he didn't. He glanced at her once, gave the smallest nod, and returned to his conversation. It was then that Elena realized something devastating. She was alone, even standing at his side. The night dragged on in a blur of music and murmurs. Elena danced with Gabriel once, his hand warm at the small of her back, his eyes soft when they met hers. For a moment she almost believed it was enough, but as they spun across the marble floor, she caught sight of the disdain in the eyes of those watching, and the illusion shattered. She couldn't live her life as a shadow in someone else's story, waiting for glances of approval, fighting whispers with silence. Later, as they returned to the car, Elena finally spoke. "'Twere cruel, Gabriel. And you said nothing?" Gabriel stiffened, caught off guard. Elena, ignoring them was the best choice. Why give their pettiness power? "Because your silence gave them power," she shot back, her voice trembling. "Do you know what it felt like, standing there, hearing them tear me apart while you stood as if it didn't matter?" His brows drew together. "I was protecting you." "And," she interrupted, her voice breaking, "you were protecting yourself, your image, your perfect mask, but you left me to drown." The car fell into suffocating silence. Gabriel stared out the window, his reflection fractured by the city lights racing past. Elena looked down at her hands, at the faint ink stains that still clung to her fingers from scribbling poetry in old journals, at the hands her mother once held, as she whispered dreams of Paris. By the time they reached the mansion, Elena had made her decision. She could no longer fight to belong in a world that would never see her as more than a waitress. Not when even Gabriel, the man who had brought her here, had let her stand alone. That night she packed quietly. A few dresses, her worn journal, and a photograph of her mother. When Gabriel entered the room later, loosening his tie, exhausted from the gala, he didn't notice the suitcase by the door. "Tomorrow," he said absently, "I'll introduce you to some of the board members. It's time they knew you." Elena's throat closed. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe he would finally defend her, claim her, see her. But the wounds of the evening bled too deeply. "I can't do this," she whispered. Gabriel turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "To stay here," she said, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "I thought Paris was my mother's dream, but tonight I realized it was never about the city. It was about being seen, truly seen. And I am invisible here, Gabriel. Even to you." His mask cracked then, his eyes searching hers desperately. "Elena, don't..." But she was already at the door, suitcase in hand. "Goodbye, Gabriel." She left him standing in the room of mirrors and chandeliers, a man surrounded by everything except the one thing that mattered. The taxi ride to the airport was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine and the occasional cough of the driver. Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching Paris slip by in fragments, bridges draped in light, cafes buzzing with late-night laughter, couples strolling arm in arm. Each sight twisted something inside her chest. This had been her mother's dream, Paris, the city of poetry and love, and yet here she was, fleeing it with a broken heart. She clutched the photo of her mother, her thumb brushing over the faded smile. "I tried, Mama," she whispered, "but I can't lose myself just to belong." When she reached Charles de Gaulle, she bought the first available ticket to New York. The cashier smiled politely, unaware that her life was unraveling with every keystroke. Elena carried her single suitcase, her journal, and her grief through the terminal like heavy stones. Back at the mansion, Gabriel stood in the room where she'd left him, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a ghost. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the liquid burned more bitterly than usual. He sank into a chair, his tie undone, staring at the door she'd walked through. Why hadn't he spoken up? Why hadn't he told those people that Elena Ramirez was not a project, not a passing charity, but the woman who had reminded him that warmth could exist beyond the walls of power? The words had been on his tongue, yet his silence had strangled them. The next morning, the tabloids blazed across headlines. Gabriel Duval, seen with waitress at Paris Gala, mystery companion leaves early. From café to chateau, is Duval's new romance a fairy tale or folly? Gabriel crushed the papers in his fists, the sound like brittle bones snapping. But worse than the press was the emptiness of the house. No soft footsteps, no laughter echoing from the library, no voice reciting poetry in French when she thought no one was listening. He tried to drown himself in work, but the spreadsheets blurred, the numbers meaningless. He attended board meetings, but the sharp suits around him spoke in cold, lifeless tones. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face, the tears she refused to let fall, the suitcase at her side. Meanwhile, in New York, Elena returned to the cafe. The scent of coffee grounds and baked bread greeted her like an old friend, familiar and grounding. Her coworkers embraced her, asking about Paris, about Gabriel, about the fairy tale they had all imagined. She smiled weakly and said little, slipping back into her apron and routine. But her heart ached every time a French tourist walked in, every time she reached for her notebook and found herself writing Gabriel's name without meaning to. One evening, as the rain pounded against the cafe windows, Elena sat in the corner during her break, scribbling in her journal. She wrote about Paris, not the luxury, not the chandeliers, but the hidden cafes Gabriel had shown her, the libraries where she had traced the spines of books like old friends, the quiet moments when he looked at her as though she were more than just a passing thought. She slammed the notebook shut, frustrated at herself. She had left for a reason. She had to remember that. Weeks passed. Gabriel tried calling, but Elena ignored his number. He sent letters, long and heartfelt, but they remained unopened in a drawer by her bedside. Each day she told herself she had done the right thing, that protecting her dignity mattered more than risking heartbreak again. But each night, as she lay awake, she wondered if she had walked away not just from him, but from something her mother would have told her to fight for. One night, Gabriel arrived at the cafe. He didn't storm in like the billionaire he was. He came quietly, wearing no suit, just a simple coat, his face lined with exhaustion. Elena's heart stuttered when she saw him, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly, wiping down the counter. "Where else would I be?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual control. "Every place I've been since you left feels empty. This is the only place that makes sense." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with both fury and longing. "You had your chance to stand by me, and you stayed silent." His chest rose and fell, the truth heavy in his lungs. "I thought silence would protect you. But I see now, you'd only betrayed you." The cafe was quiet, the rain outside their only witness. Elena's hands trembled as she set down the cloth. "Do you know what it felt like, Gabriel, to be surrounded by people who despised me? To feel their eyes burning through me, and then to look at you, the one person who could have changed everything, and see you choose silence?" He closed his eyes briefly, pain flashing across his face. "I failed you. I failed myself. I was a coward?" For a moment, Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to collapse into his arms and forget the ache of the past weeks. But the wound was still raw. She shook her head. "I can't do this again." She walked away, disappearing into the back of the cafe. Gabriel stood there, drenched from the rain, watching the only woman he had ever truly wanted slip further from him. That night, alone in his hotel room, Gabriel stared out at the New York skyline. The city buzzed below, alive with ambition, but all he felt was silence. He realized then that wealth had built him walls, but Elena had been the first to climb them. And when she left, she took the light with her. For Elena, life returned to its rhythm. But every time she saw a little girl holding her mother's hand, every time she passed a bookstore and remembered Gabriel's gaze when she recited French poetry, she felt the ache. Her mother had always told her love was not about fairy tales, but about courage. Elena had found her courage once in Paris, but now she wondered if she had lost it when she walked away. The breaking point had come and gone, leaving two hearts fractured across an ocean. Paris was behind them, New York stretched ahead, and neither knew if the bridge between them could ever be rebuilt. But deep down, in the quiet corners of their hearts, both knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. The park was alive with the hum of the city, children laughing, parents chatting, street musicians filling the air with soft guitar chords. Elena sat on a bench, her notebook open in her lap. Across from her, a young girl sat cross-legged, clutching a worn copy of a French poetry collection. The girl's parents, tourists from Montreal, had asked Elena to translate a few lines for her, but Elena had gone further. She began to read aloud, her voice steady, her accent pure and lilting. The girl listened, eyes wide with awe. Elena's words fell like music, gentle yet powerful, filling the space around them. She didn't notice the small crowd forming, strangers pausing to hear the waitress speak like a Parisian poet. She didn't see the tourist lifting his phone, recording the moment with shaking hands. She only saw the child's face brighten, her world expanding through syllables Elena had loved since. When she finished, the little girl clapped and whispered, "Encore." Elena laughed, cheeks flushed, and read another verse, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. For a fleeting moment, she felt like herself again. Not a scandal, not a target of cruel whispers, but simply a woman sharing beauty with someone who needed it. That night, the video appeared online. It was titled simply, "The Waitress Who Speaks Like a Parisian Poet." Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Comments, "Who's a waitress? She sounds like she belongs in the Sorbonne. I get the billionaires. This woman is the real Paris." I'd listened to her read the phone book. By morning, the clip had gone viral, viewed millions of times across platforms. News anchors replayed it, bloggers dissected it, and hashtags trended worldwide. Parisian soul, poet waitress. Gabriel saw it by accident. He was sitting alone in his Manhattan penthouse, the TV on low, while he sifted through reports he couldn't focus on. The anchor's words caught his attention. A farewell video of a New York waitress who left Parisians enchanted. He looked up, and there she was, Elena, sitting on the park bench, reading poetry with the same grace that had once moved him in the quiet of a Paris library. His throat tightened. His silence had driven her away, reduced her to whispers and gossip, but here she was, reclaiming herself with nothing but words and dignity. The whiskey glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. He didn't even flinch. His chest ached, his mind replaying her voice on loop. That was the voice that had healed him, that had brought him warmth when he had buried himself in mistrust and control. That was the woman he had betrayed with his silence. For the first time in years, Gabriel felt tears burn his eyes. He let them fall. That same night, he sat at his desk, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond his windows. He pulled out pen and paper, not his lawyers, not his PR team, not his polished press releases, just his own hand, his own words. For hours, he wrote and rewrote, crossing out lines, tearing pages, until finally the truth spilled in ink. By dawn, the letter was finished. He didn't send it privately. He didn't hide it in apology cards. He sent it to the largest paper in France, attaching his name, his signature, and his vulnerability. The next morning, the headline blazed across front pages. Gabriel Duval's open letter. The soul of Paris I never found in wealth. The letter read, "I once believed Paris lived in its chandeliers, its vaulted ceilings, its marble halls. But I was wrong. Paris lives in voices like hers, voices that rise from humility, from scars, from dreams too fragile for wealth to touch. Elena Ramirez is not a scandal, nor a charity project. She is the soul of Paris I never found in fortune. She reminded me that beauty is not owned, it is shared, and I was a fool to forget that." Public opinion shifted overnight. Where once there had been mockery, now there was admiration. Commentators called it the most vulnerable statement Gabriel had ever made. Ordinary people praised his courage to admit fault. Others rallied behind Elena, her dignity finally restored. Elena read the letter alone in her small apartment. Her hands trembled as she held the paper, Gabriel's words staring back at her. The man who had betrayed her had written something no wealth, no press team could manufacture. It was raw, it was real. Her chest ached as she whispered the final line aloud. She reminded me that beauty is not owned, it is shared. For the first time in weeks, Elena allowed herself to cry. Not from humiliation, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen. Truly seen. But forgiveness was another matter. The world did not let her grieve in silence. Within days, reporters swarmed the café where she worked. Customers doubled, then tripled, hoping to hear the poet waitress read aloud. Offers came from publishers, invitations from universities, even interview requests from French cultural societies. Elena refused them all. She continued to pour coffee, wipe tables, and smiled politely. But inside, she was torn. Gabriel's letter had shifted the world's view of her, yet she still couldn't forget the sting of his silence that night at the gala. One evening, her boss pulled her aside. "You can't hide forever, Elena. The world is listening." She shook her head. "They're not listening to me. They're listening to a story someone else wrote about me. That's not the same thing." But deep down, she knew the story wasn't just someone else's. It was hers too. Meanwhile, Gabriel faced the storm from his own side. His board was furious. Investors questioned his stability, his judgment, his future. But Gabriel didn't flinch. For the first time, the empire he had built didn't matter more than the truth he had written. He let them rage, let them threaten, because the only thing he cared about was whether Elena had read the letter and whether it had meant something to her. He tried calling again, no answer. He wrote more letters, but she returned them unopened. Weeks passed. Still, he didn't give up. Then, one rainy evening, Elena found herself walking through Central Park, her notebook clutched in her hand. She sat on a bench, just as she had in Paris, and began to read softly to herself. The rain pattered on her umbrella, her words. A shadow fell across her page. She looked up, and there he was. Gabriel. No suit, no entourage, no armor. Just a man in a raincoat, his hair damp, his eyes raw with exhaustion. "Helena," he said softly. Her throat tightened. She wanted to turn away, to protect herself, but something in his voice stopped her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Had to be. He knelt in the rain, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "I wrote those words because they were all I had left. But words mean nothing if they don't change me. Let me show you I can change." Her heart warred against itself. The memory of his silence still cut deep, but his letter, his presence now, the way he stripped away his walls, these things pressed against her defenses. "Me, Gabriel?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You could have anyone, and yet you chose to break me, and now you're here again. Why?" His eyes glistened. "Because you reminded me that wealth is empty without someone to share it with. Because when you spoke, the world didn't just hear poetry, they heard truth. And I realized the truth I needed most was you." The rain blurred her vision, mingling with her tears. She wanted to resist, but his words sank into her like roots breaking through stone. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then, slowly, Elena let him take her hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might lead them both home. The flight back to New York was not triumphant. Gabriel sat in first class, with the curtain drawn, but there was nothing luxurious about the way he clutched the armrest or the emptiness in his chest. The city lights twinkled below him like scattered diamonds, but they meant nothing without her. Elena had taken her dignity, her fire, her poetry, and left him behind with silence that screamed louder than his wealth ever could. He tried again when he landed. He found her café, waited at the corner table, ordered coffee after coffee, but she never came. He sent flowers, left untouched. He called, the phone rang, into the void. She had slipped through his fingers once more, and for a man who could control markets, corporations, and global negotiations, the helplessness nearly undid him. One evening, exhausted, he returned to his penthouse and found a small envelope slipped under his door. The handwriting was childlike, uneven. His pulse raced as he unfolded the paper. It was from Emma, the little girl Elena had befriended in Paris, the child who had listened wide-eyed to her poetry in the park. "Dear Mr. Gabriel, please don't give up on Miss Elena. She makes people smile like Paris lights. She told me love is like a bridge. You have to be brave to walk across. Don't let her walk alone. From Emma." The note hit him harder than the headlines, harder than his board's fury, harder than the ache of her absence. A child had seen what he hadn't, that Elena's love wasn't something to be earned with wealth, but with courage. He folded the paper carefully, slid it into his pocket, and knew what he had to do. Days later, he was in Paris again. He searched not the luxury hotels, not the glittering boulevards, but the quiet corners Elena's mother had once loved. The libraries, the tucked-away gardens, the banks of the Seine. He finally found her, one gray afternoon, standing still at the water's edge, her reflection rippling in the rain. Elena wore no makeup, no finery, just a simple coat, her hair damp and clinging to her face. She looked like she belonged there, part of the city itself, fragile and eternal all at once. Gabriel stopped a few paces behind her, his breath misting in the cold. "Elena," he said softly. She didn't turn. Her hand tightened on the railing, her shoulders stiff. "Why are you here, Gabriel?" "Because I can't stay away," he admitted. The rain was seeping into his collar, plastering his shirt to his chest, but he didn't care. "I've built empires, crossed oceans, but nothing I've conquered has ever filled me like you did when you looked at me in that café. When you read that poem. When you believed I could be more than money." Her laugh was brittle, but it cracked under the weight of unshed tears. "Belief isn't enough, not when silence is louder than love. You left me alone in that room, Gabriel. Do you know what it's like to stand among people who look at you like you're dirt, while the one man who brought you there says nothing?" He flinched as though she'd struck him, because she was right. His silence had been the cruelest betrayal. He stepped closer, his voice raw. "I didn't defend you because I thought silence was safer. But silence is what killed me. I didn't bring you here to change you, Elena. I brought you here to change me." She turned then, slowly, her eyes dark pools of pain and longing. Rain streamed down her cheeks, mingling with tears. "You think words will fix everything?" she asked, her voice shaking. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Emma's letter, now crumpled and wet but still legible. He handed it to her with trembling fingers. "Not just words, truth. Even a child can see what I was too blind to admit. I don't want a project, Elena. I don't want a scandal. I want you. I want the woman who turned Paris into poetry again." Elena read the letter, her lips parting as she saw Emma's uneven scrawl. Her chest tightened. Emma's faith, Gabriel's rawness, the city her mother had once dreamed of. It was all too much. She covered her mouth with her hand, sobs breaking free at last. Gabriel closed the distance between them. He didn't touch her yet. He simply stood, letting the rain wash away everything false, everything guarded. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Not for Paris, not for the headlines, for me. For the man I want to be when I'm with you." Gina shook her head, tears spilling. "I wanted Paris for my mother," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But I stayed for you, and you broke me." His chest split open at her words, his breath shuddering. He stepped forward at last, gently taking her hands in his, pressing them to his chest. "Then let me rebuild you, not with marble or gold, but with every day I have left. Elena, I love you." The words were ragged, desperate but true, and in the rain they felt like absolution. The rain poured harder, blurring the lights of the Seine into streaks of silver and gold. Elena's tears were indistinguishable from the storm, her body trembling as though the truth itself was too heavy to bear. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the water rushing below them. "To love me means facing the whispers, the gossip, the ones who will never let me forget where I came from." "Don't care," Gabriel said fiercely. "Let them whisper, let them mock. They've already tried to strip me of everything, and I survived. But I won't survive losing you again. I don't need the board, the investors, the world's approval. I need you." His words were unlike any speech he'd ever given in a boardroom. There was no polish, no strategy, just raw truth. And that truth struck Elena deeper than she wanted to admit. She shook her head, torn, clutching his hands tighter. "What if I fail you, Gabriel? What if I'm not enough for this world of yours?" His eyes softened, filled with an ache she'd never seen in him before. "Then we'll fail together. Because for the first time, I don't want perfection. I want love. I want imperfection. I want you, exactly as you are." Something in her broke. Then, not in despair, but in surrender. For so long she had carried her mother's dreams, her own fears, the weight of a world that told her she wasn't enough. But here, in the rain, Gabriel wasn't asking her to be enough. He was asking her to be herself. She dropped the letter, letting it fall into the river below, carried away by the current. Then, with a trembling breath, she whispered, "I stayed for you, Gabriel. Even when it hurt. Even when it felt impossible, I stayed." The dam shattered between them. Gabriel pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the world might rip her away again. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest, their tears mixing with the rain. Neither cared about the storm, the curious glances of passers-by, or the headlines that might follow. All that mattered was that at last they had stopped running from the truth. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, over and over, as if repetition could carve it into the very stones of Paris. "I love you, Elena." She lifted her face at last, eyes luminous despite the storm. "I love you too," she whispered, and then she kissed him, desperate, tender, broken, and healing all at once. The Seine roared below them. The rain fell unrelenting, but in that moment, Paris belonged to them. Not the Paris of chandeliers and boardrooms, but the Paris of whispered poetry, of bridges crossed hand in hand, of souls laid bare beneath the storm. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Elena laughed softly through her tears. "You're soaked, Gabriel." He smiled, the first unguarded smile she had ever seen on his face. "Then, so are you." And with that, they walked away from the river together, hand in hand, ready to face the world, not as billionaire and waitress, not as scandal and gossip, but as two people who had finally chosen love over fear. 1 year later, Paris and New York felt less like two separate worlds, and more like two sides of the same life. Elena and Gabriel were married now, and though their wedding had been small, just family, close friends, and a few children from the community they had supported, it had been filled with more love than any Gabriel had ever attended in his years among the elite. Their days were divided between Gabriel's soaring penthouse in New York and the warm, Parisian apartment Elena had chosen, filled not with marble and chandeliers, but with shelves of books, fresh flowers, and the little things that made life feel like poetry. Gabriel no longer lived in the shadow of board meetings and investor calls. His empire ran. But he no longer let it consume him. He had stepped back, carefully, deliberately, so that he could step forward into something greater: family, love, and purpose. Together, they had founded the Duval Foundation for Language and Culture, a vision born from Elena's story, her mother's unfulfilled dream, and Gabriel's belief that legacy meant more than buildings and bank accounts. The foundation provided scholarships for underprivileged children, teaching them not only new languages, but offering them chances to travel, to see the world beyond their borders, to believe they could belong anywhere. Elena poured herself into the work. She taught classes, not as a celebrity or as Madame Duval, but as Elena, the girl who had once waited tables, the daughter of a woman who had whispered French lullabies in a tiny apartment. When she stood before classrooms of wide-eyed children, she told them of her mother, who had never reached Paris, and how speaking French had once made her feel close to the woman she missed. The children listened, not because she was polished, but because she was real. Gabriel often watched her from the back of the room. He saw the way her words lit fires in children who had only known shadows, the way her encouragement turned stumbling sentences into bold attempts. For him, it was a reminder that the most powerful wealth was not counted in stocks, but in the courage she planted in others. The year had not been without challenges. The press still whispered. Some called her the waitress who married a billionaire. Others doubted the foundation, accusing it of being a vanity project. But Elena learned to stand tall, not through denial, but through truth. She would say calmly in interviews, "Yes, I was a waitress. I was also a daughter, a dreamer, and now I am a teacher. Every part of me mattered." And Gabriel, who once might have fought with silence, now spoke with conviction. He defended her openly, declaring more than once that Elena was not only his wife, but his anchor, his compass. The final proof of their strength came at the gala that marked the first anniversary of the foundation. It was held in Paris, in a hall filled with children, families, teachers, and supporters. The walls were lined with photographs of students who had traveled abroad, holding up handwritten signs in French, Spanish, English, Mandarin. Gabriel gave a short speech, brief and deliberate. He spoke of the journey, the purpose, but he knew the night belonged not to him, but to Elena. She stepped onto the stage in a simple gown, her hair pulled back, a single silver ring gleaming on her finger. The crowd quieted, and even those who had doubted her leaned in. She didn't begin with statistics or polished phrases. Instead, she spoke of her mother. She told the story of the woman who had never left New York, who had dreamed of Paris but left her daughter only a love for a language and a handful of books. Her voice cracked as she described how she once felt small, invisible, trapped in a café uniform, until one day kindness and chance collided and gave her wings. "Now," Elena said, her eyes glistening as she looked over the audience, "I see my mother's dream not only alive but multiplied in every child here. We are proof that words, when spoken with courage, can change lives." The room erupted into applause, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was what happened afterward, when the crowd dispersed into conversations and music, and Elena slipped quietly to the edge of the room. A young waitress, no older than she had been on that night in New York, approached her nervously with a broken outlook. "Madame, votre discours était très..." Her accent was heavy, her words uneven, but her courage was clear. Elena smiled warmly, taking the girl's hand gently. "It's not how perfect you sound," she said softly, in French. "It's the courage to speak that matters." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered a shy, "Thank you," before hurrying off, leaving Elena standing with her heart full. From across the room, Gabriel had watched the exchange. He didn't move at first. He simply stood there, pride swelling in his chest until it almost hurt. He realized in that quiet moment that his empire, the companies, the skyscrapers, the investments, were only shadows compared to the light Elena had brought into his life. When she returned to him, he took her hand in his, kissed her knuckles tenderly, and whispered, This is the legacy I never knew I needed." The gala ended with laughter, music, and children darting between tables, but for Elena and Gabriel, it lingered as more than an event. It was a symbol of everything they had endured, the gossip, the heartbreak, the choices that had nearly broken them, and how all of it had been reshaped into something that would last beyond them. At night, back at their Paris apartment, Elena sat by the window, her hair loose, her gown replaced by one of Gabriel's shirts. She looked out at the city lights, her hands curled around a cup of tea. Gabriel joined her, sliding his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. "You ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "What if I hadn't written that note in the café? What if you had thrown away the ticket?" Elena smiled faintly, resting her head against his chest. "I think about it all the time, and every time I realize, if not that day, another day would have found us. Because I believe some bridges are meant to be crossed, no matter how afraid we are." He kissed her temple, his heart steady in a way it had never been before. For years, Gabriel had believed legacy meant permanence, ironclad contracts, and empires carved into the skyline. But Elena had shown him another kind of permanence, the kind built not on stone, but on people, on words, on love. Over the next months, the foundation expanded. Elena developed programs that paired children from different countries as language partners, teaching each other phrases, exchanging letters, and eventually meeting through cultural exchanges. Gabriel, who had once lived behind walls of suspicion, found himself traveling with her, not for profit, but for presence. He saw children in classrooms from New Delhi to Buenos Aires, their faces lighting up as they spoke in tongues that had once been foreign. At one such event, a boy shyly stood and introduced himself in hesitant French. His voice cracked, his pronunciation faltered, but Elena applauded as though he had spoken poetry. Later, Gabriel asked her why she praised so loudly when the boy had clearly struggled. She smiled, her eyes glimmering, because it wasn't about how perfect he sounded. It was about how brave he was to try. That's what my mother always told me. Courage matters more than perfection. Gabriel held her gaze, struck again by the simplicity and power of her truth. The final scene came one evening in Paris, at the second annual gala. This time, Elena wasn't nervous. She walked among the guests with ease, speaking in English, French, Spanish, switching effortlessly, making each child, each parent feel seen. Gabriel stood nearby, letting her shine, because he knew this was her gift, her calling. As the night drew to a close, another shy young waitress approached Elena, balancing a tray of empty glasses. She lowered her eyes, then whispered in broken French, "Someday, I want to speak like you." Elena knelt to her level, smiling. "You already do," she said gently, "because you dared to try. That's where it begins." The girl's eyes widened, hope flickering like a candle. Elena squeezed her hand before sending her off, the moment small but infinite. Gabriel watched from a few feet away, emotion tightening his throat. When Elena rejoined him, he leaned close, whispering as though the world could hear. "You've given me more than love. You've given me legacy, not in money, not in power, but in voices, in courage, in bridges built across oceans." She rested her head against him, their fingers entwined, and for the first time in his life, Gabriel Duval understood what it meant to be wealthy in the truest sense, not by the numbers in his accounts, but by the lives touched through the woman he loved. As the music swelled and the lights glimmered over Paris, Gabriel whispered one final truth to himself, one he knew would carry beyond their years. "This is the legacy I want to leave behind.